When we compare townhouses in Ottawa to apartment condos and single family homes, the sales data actually looks pretty good. I would definitely consider this the bright spot of the monthly update for February. So I figured we would take a little bit of a break from the bad news, look at where things are going not well, but like relatively well, better than other parts of the market before we wander back into the ever sinking morass that is the Ottawa apartment condo market. Now, it's by no means all sunshine and rainbows for townhouses, but it's definitely better. So let's jump into the numbers and take a look at why that's the case. The first thing we're going to look at again here is the February sales volume numbers. So this is every February over the last 10 years since 2017. And we can see here that February 2026, we're actually above this red dashed line here, which is the 10-year average. So as far as townhouse sales in the early part of 2026, we're outperforming every year since 2022. So that's a really positive sign as to the number of townhouse sales that are happening. Now, if we go to the next slide here, we can compare the townhouse sales to the previous couple of years. And you can see January, we were a little bit above as well, but we actually really opened up a much bigger gap heading into February. Now, the meat and potatoes of any year is always kind of April, May, June. Like those are the peak selling months. So we want to make sure this trajectory continues before we declare that the condo or the townhouse market is heading in a really positive direction. But this is a promising start for sure. So over the next couple months, we'll really start to see whether or not this is just a blip, because February is still a relatively quiet month. The stats can be a little bit off with that lower sales volume kind of sample size, but a really promising start to 2026 for townhouses. Now, jumping over to the next slide, we'll look at the number of listings that are sitting on the market at the end of the month. Now, with the higher sales volume, we're also still seeing higher listings sitting on the market at the end of the month. So the listing volume is definitely promising, but I was a little surprised to see that this number wasn't lower, because I assumed with more listings being gobbled up by buyers, there'd be fewer sitting on the end of the month. But while there's a lot of sales activity, there's also a lot of people listing their townhomes. Now, despite that higher amount of listings on the market, we are seeing a pretty low months of inventory here at 2.36. And this is pretty convincingly in seller's market territory. It's not borderline the way the overall market or detached properties are, kind of flirting right with that 4 months of inventory. We're at 2.36 months of inventory. So like we're well into seller's market territory. Things are turning over pretty quick. Months of inventory, again, is when we take the number of listings on the market at the end of the month, divide it by the rate at which properties were selling that month, and it gives us a measure of absorption. Low months of inventory means market's pretty hot. High months of inventory means it's slow. The list to sales price ratio here, 98%, is also telling us that people on average are able to negotiate 2% off of the final list price of the property. I say final list price because this does not take into considerations any cancel or relists. So if the property started at like 600K, they dropped it to 550 and then it sold for 525. This stat is only tracking the 550 to 525. It doesn't take into consideration that other decrease that happened previously. But we can see here that the number of listings on the market at the end of the month has crept up a little since January. Will be interesting to see if the demand keeps up, if the number of sales keeps up, whether or not this amount of inventory on the end of the month starts to go down. Looking quickly at the average days on market, we can see that it went down a little. Makes sense with the higher months of inventory. The listings that are on the market for a lower period of time. So we went down from 50 all the way down to 40. This is not a perfect stat either. Again, the cancel relist thing can throw that off a little bit, but a good measure to keep track of. Good to see that properties are selling a little bit quicker in that townhouse sector than they were in January. Not altogether unexpected, as for the winter months, as the year goes on and we approach spring, generally the days on market goes down. And lastly, we want to take a look at price. So this is always an interesting graph to look at. I track it for the last 5 years just so we can see kind of where things were at the peak, because I find that's where a lot of people like to kind of compare their listing price to. because I find that's something that most people remember. And a lot of people have a neighbor that sold a few years ago and they heard they sold for some outlandish number. And this is just to drive home that we are not in that market anymore. We can see here 669.4 was the average townhouse benchmark price in the peak in 2022, and we're down just over 16% to 560,000. Interestingly, we saw a pretty big jump since January, so a promising start. But if we look back at other Januaries here, we can see there's usually a jump between January, February, and March as more better inventory hits the market. So I wouldn't read too much into this, but if this continues to go up into March, April, then we can probably start to read into that trend a little bit more. 2.2% increase year over year is the exact difference between that 548 and that 560. That's it for this month for townhouses. Short and sweet. I hope this was helpful if you were looking in this section of the market. If you want any further breakdowns as far as what particular neighborhoods or complexes are doing or streets, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be happy to assist in any way that I can. Appreciate you so much taking the time to watch. Have a wonderful rest of your day and take care.